before we talk about the complex idea of data governance, I want to talk about why this thing is necessary. And to do that, we're going to jump back to our analogy before of our cute little book warehouse where we've got all of our books for our online retailer. What I want us to think about then is what would happen if we were trying to be a good, effective, efficient online bookseller if people took books without writing down what they took. We wouldn't know what our stock levels were. We wouldn't know what was available and what we could give to clients. What happens when people put books in the wrong place? What if they're not there? What if somebody just decides that it's too hard to walk all the way to the end of that long hallway and they just start stacking them at the front? We wouldn't know where anything was. And if people didn't record information about books in the right way, if they just said, no, I can't be bothered filling in a description for what this book is. The book has all of that information. If you want to know what the book's about, just go get the book. If we didn't write that down, we couldn't search and users couldn't search to find books. They wouldn't be able to find the thing that they're interested in, which means that if we didn't do any of that, we just wouldn't be able to find anything. And if we can't find any books, we can't sell any books. So really, we need to make sure that everybody's just making sure that they're documenting what books they have and how they're using these so that we can be an effective bookseller. To be effective, we need all of these things. Anybody who takes a book or changes what a book's about or changes where a book sits because they've changed the topic, they need to write down what they did. We need to make sure everybody has a consistent set of rules to follow so that they know that they're storing the books properly. If you want me to put the book in the right place, you're going to have to tell me where in the warehouse to go and how I do it. And we need to make sure that everybody knows what they need to record so we can use those books to get the most value. Regardless of whether or not you're an Amazon scale online seller, a small bookstore or a library, everybody needs to be recording those books in the same way so we can get the best possible outcome. And then lastly, the person who's responsible for this warehouse needs to be able to review what people are doing. They need to be able to go in and look to make sure that the rules are effective and up to date, and they need to be able to review that they've documented the right things, they've written down all the correct topics. Because if people aren't recording the topics for the book, then people aren't going to be able to find related books. They're not going to be able to look for books on a topic of interest. They're not going to be able to get value out of this, and that means that I'm not going to be able to sell books. So for me to be a good bookseller, I need to make sure I know what all the books are, where they are, and I need to make sure everybody's doing the right job for me. So funnily enough, this pretty much applies directly to our data. We're back in our data warehouse now. We've gone from our book warehouse to our data warehouse. And for us to use data effectively to get value out of this data asset, we need to know who's creating data. Everybody's creating data. We need to know that, we need to know who's doing it. We need to know what data they've got. So we need them to write down what data they've got. Where is it? How can I use it? Who's responsible for it? But that also means that we need to tell people what they need to do. They need to know how to store data properly. They need to know how to store their metadata properly. They need to know what the rules are so that they know that they're doing a good job. And generally, people do want to do a good job. They need to know what they have to record. We can't just say do better. We have to say, give us a name, give us a description. Tell us where your data is. Tell us who's responsible for it. There's lots of other little things that we might want to know, but making sure that they know the basics and making sure they know what to do with data when they create new data or transform data or get rid of data is really important. And then lastly, the role of governance is making sure that the people who are responsible for the management of these data warehouses and responsible for data across our organizations know what's happening. Just like in our bookseller, we want to be able to review the card catalog, we want to review the book catalog. We also need to be able to review our data catalog. We need to make sure that we can, review that to ensure that quality standards are being met. We want to make sure that everybody's kind of doing their part to make sure that we can get the best value out of our data that we can. So what is data governance? Data governance is really a simple principle, and a lot of governance ideas, they use this topic of people, process, and technology. People is what we do from a cultural perspective. What is our organization doing? Processes are what are the things that we want people to be able to do, and then technology is, what are the tools we can give them to make that effective. So people is, making sure that we've got an environment where people know what they have to do. Process is giving them the rules and reviewing those rules over time. And then technology is things like, our data catalog. What do we have where people can document what they've got? What do we have where people can review the documentation as well? The way that I like to think about it is there's questions that we can ask around this, to understand if we're doing data governance properly. We ask, are people following the processes correctly? We can review our book catalog and go, people aren't filling in information. We're not going to be able to find any books. We do the same with our data. Are people documenting the data they've got? Do they know why this is important? Is there an education piece we need to build in as part of this process? Do people understand why it's important for them to do this? We have a technology piece, which is, when we bring people and technology together, we go, do we have the right tools? It's not enough for us to say that there's a process that we have to follow. It's also about making sure that the tooling supports that. Data scales very, very quickly. We can bring in lots of data very, very quickly into our organizations. Is the tooling we've got supporting people doing that? And also, is it supporting them in a way that they can actually achieve? Are we asking them to do too much? And how do we scale that backwards and forwards to make sure that we can get the best value from their time that we can? A good process is only as good as people being able to do it, and a tool supports that. And then lastly is, do the tools, does the technology that we bring in make it easy to monitor if these processes are being followed? So not only do we want to make it easy for people to do the right thing, we really need to make sure that we're reviewing that over time as well. Because if we're not reviewing what's happening, then we're not really governing this properly. It might be just coincidental that we've got the right people who care in the right ways. But one other thing that we need to do for this to be proper governance, for this to be something that we can take to our senior executives, which is where governance needs to live, is, can we review it and provide those metrics across time to make sure that we know that people are doing the right things effectively? So what is data governance? Data governance is really a simple principle. And a lot of governance ideas, they use this topic of people, process, and technology. People is what we do from a cultural perspective. What is our organization doing? Processes are what are the things that we want people to be able to do? And then technology is, what are the tools we can give them to make that effective? So people is, making sure that we've got an environment where people know what they have to do. Process is giving them the rules and reviewing those rules over time. And then technology is things like, our data catalog. What do we have where people can document what they've got? What do we have where people can review the documentation as well? the way that I like to think about data governance is as an activity that we do, across the entire organization. Everybody needs to take an active role in making sure our data is handled safely and correctly, and that starts with telling people what they should do. We tell people what they should do when they create information or update information. Just like whenever a book comes into our book catalog, we make sure that we're recording all the necessary information. Every time somebody creates data, what are they doing to document where that data is stored and how it was captured? How are they treating it securely? That needs to be fed into a really thorough review process. We don't need people who are experts in all data across the organization, but we need them to be experts in that documentation, experts in metadata, who are looking through those records and going, who's doing their job, who's filling in the necessary information so that we know that data is being handled safely across the organization. And that needs to be a back and forth between our subject matter experts within the business areas and data governance experts who can help them improve that quality over time. This then needs to be fed up to our senior executives who need to take an active role in understanding what activities are happening across the whole organisation. Chief Data Officers are only one part of that senior executive suite, and they're limited in what they can do to make other people take action. By reporting data governance activities across the executive area, we can get other business units involved in this process and making them aware of any particular gaps that are in those business areas so they can start to help solve the problem alongside us. And then lastly, we need to focus on that topic of continuous improvement. We're not perfect, and every organisation is going to have their own challenges as new technology evolves over time. When we find gaps, what are we doing to change those processes and communicate the changes to those processes across the entire business area? If all of us are creating data, if all of us are using data in our organizations, it makes sense that we're all part of that data governance process. This framework helps us kind of talk about that from a whole of organization perspective so everybody knows what they need to be doing as we treat data across its entire life cycle. So really, the questions that data governance answers are this. For data users, what we need to do is we need to make sure that there's an environment that tells them what to do. And it really does need to be simple. Just like that hand washing exercise is, when you create new data, you write these things down. When you use data from somewhere else, this is what you do. When you dispose of data, which we do need to do more often, this is what you do to make sure that we know that you did it properly. And who can I talk to? And that's a really important one. Is data governance is really an enabler. It's really a support function. Who do I talk to get more help? We see this a lot in HR, where in HR governance we don't expect one person to be monitoring everything across the organisation. We provide HR support to help people know that they're doing the right thing. They have someone to go to understand how to do better. So really making sure that there's an assistance piece. For our data governance areas and for our chief data officers, our CDOs, what we want to know is, are we able to monitor that people are doing the right thing? We understand that this is a big part of business, is just monitoring to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction. Monitoring isn't about compliance, it isn't about punishment. Monitoring is really about making sure that we're doing the best that we can. We want to make sure that data is being used safely. If we're all doing the right thing, we just want to make sure that data is being used for the correct purposes, and we want to know that it's being used in a safe way, because nobody wants a data leak. Nobody wants a data breach. They don't want to be, the next case study in what happens when client data gets sold on the dark web. So how do we make sure that we can just, monitor that people are doing the right things? And how do we have the best systems that support that? Technology is important, technology is valuable, but it's not a process of just buying some software and seeing some results. It's about making sure that we've got the best tool for the problem that we've got right now. And ultimately, it comes back to that final dot point, which is, are we getting the best value from our data? Data costs money. It costs money to collect. It costs money to transform and produce dashboards from. It costs money to store. Even in the cloud, whether it's cloud or on-prem, we have to buy a server or we rent a server from somewhere else. Data costs money to hold and maintain and collect. So the question is, are we getting the right business value? Are we achieving the right business outcome from that cost? And that's really important, is making sure we're able to address that concern directly and say, yeah, it's costing us money to hold this data, but we're also getting a lot of business benefits and a lot of business value out of it. And that is what all of these processes and steps are all about. Making sure that we have people who believe the right things, that they understand why this is important, but also that we're communicating that they're doing the right things. So that's a really important part of this, is making sure that we're telling people what to do. When you see this problem, wash your hands. When you create new data, make sure that you update the data inventory. Make sure that you document it properly, and make sure that you're telling people who are endorsing it what you've done and why you've done it in certain ways. So what we're going to do through this process is step through all of these steps and talk about how they relate to and support practical data governance, so we can really make sure that we're getting the best value from our data, and how the MAST methodology supports making sure that we are getting the best value from our data.